Hi, I'm Lee Kelso, host of the HealthCall Live Radio Hour. I'm glad that you're here to understand better how food that we eat delivers more than nutrition to our bodies. It's also talking to our genes, and that might be influencing our health. Let's learn more about that by jumping up to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to the University of Michigan, and talk with Assistant Professor Monica Deuce. She is a molecular biologist who researches exactly what's going on and how food influences our genes. So excited to talk with you today.
Hi, Lee. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to tell you more about this topic.
Well, let's dig right in with what we've learned by watching and studying honeybees tells us about our own influence in our bodies that food can have.
Yes, this is an amazing story. So you probably heard about queen bees and worker bees. What you might not know is that actually they are genetically identical organism, and one becomes a queen and the other one becomes a worker just because of the food they eat. And this is not just a change in their status, queen versus worker. It's actually a completely different physiology. So the queen bee can live for years. She's fertile. She gives birth to the entire hive. But the worker bee, on the other hand, only live for a few weeks, and they have different roles within the colony, and they're completely sterile. That is only because of the food they eat. The queen eats something called royal jelly, whereas the worker bees during development end up eating pollen and other things.
Fascinating, isn't it? And so what does that tell us about what food is doing in our bodies? It's more than just nutrition.
Yes. So what that sort of told me, that really striking example, is that although we usually think of food, what did I eat this morning? What am I going to eat at lunch, as calories or as fuel for our bodies, there's an additional component to food. I like to think of it as information, something that connects directly with our genome and the physiology of our cells to really shape very intimately some of the inner workings down to the molecular level.
So I think people associate genes with things like hair color and eye color and that kind of thing, but it's not a static system. It's not set at birth and then never changes. On a simple level, can you kind of walk us through how genes are activated and what that does in our body?
Yes. So we have to remember that every single cell in my body and your body and every human body actually shares the same genome. So because we all came from a single cell, half from mom, half from dad. So we have about 25,000 genes, but not all those genes are on at the same time. So your brain cells turn on a set of genes and turn off another set of genes that allows them to be electrically excitable and do all the things that brain cells do. And then our liver cells turn on a different set of genes. And so this really depends on the workings of these genetic switches. And so like the switches from lights in the room, genes also have switches. And the switches essentially determine whether the gene is turned on or off, where it's on, how much it's on. And this determines whether the cell can be a neuron, like the identity of the cell, but also how fast it's dividing, how it's responding to temperature or nutrients, and many things.
Clearly, then, the foods that we choose to eat are turning on and off our genes at various intensities and levels. So what does that tell us about how that influences health? So food directly tied to health by messaging genes. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, so food has all these different macro and micronutrients. And so parts of this nutrients, essentially, like I said, can affect the way these genetic switches are regulated or controlled inside the cell and inside in the genome. And these genetic switches have important roles for all kind of things, such as division. So, for example, we know that some cancer cells are quote unquote addicted to nutrients, and these nutrients differ depending on the type of cancers. So some type of cancer, for example, are very sensitive to the levels of some amino acids and sugars that are circulating in the blood, because they enhance this particular pathway, that when this pathway feels these nutrients, then promotes the division and the growth of the cancer. And so in that case, one might think about that. If we now try to starve or prevent the cancer from getting to those nutrients, then we might affect its ability to divide or to migrate to different tissues.
Oh man, that is very interesting. Well, I think we could probably do a whole segment on that alone, but I want to focus about some dietary choices that we make and what evidence there might be that it's influencing us. So for example, if I am eating a high sugar diet, what information are my genes receiving and how is that affecting my health?
So one of the things we know about sugar is that when we have sugar, a lot of sugar in our diets, and I should precise that most of the sugar we eat, it's not from sources where we know sugar is coming from. It's usually from food that are prepackaged or processed that end up having a lot of sugar for a number of different reasons. So it's sort of this hidden sugars. So we know that when animals eat foods that have some extra sugar, essentially they tend to eat more. And so we don't actually know the reasons behind it. Why is that we cannot regulate our food intake as well as when we eat other kinds of food? So in our lab, we study how that affects the cells that sense sugar in the tongue or the mouth. And so what we found is that diet high in sugar actually activated this metabolic pathway, then end up turning off some genetic switches in the nucleus, then makes a cell less likely or less sensitive to sense sugar. So essentially the animals that eat a lot of sugar end up feeling less of it in their mouth. So the intensity of sweetness is less. And this ends up creating the circumstances so that they want it more and they consume more of it.
I get it. So we become sort of accustomed, our bodies adjust and we need more. It's like an addict. You need more and more and more to get high every time, right?
There is a desensitization to this. And in fact, some of your listener might have quit sugar or, cut down on sugar. Some people, especially that have tried a ketogenic diet or even a paleo diet where there are low levels of refined sugar, might notice that after a few weeks or a few months, they actually cannot, they taste sugar so much, the sweetness of sugar, that they actually are unable, don't find pleasant some of the things they used to eat that they used to eat before, because each person essentially has a bliss point for sweetness. And this bliss point, though, depends on diet. And some of that, it's because of the effects of sugar on genetic switches.
Are there foods that are particularly active in forming activity in our genes?
Yes, actually, one major way of, well, it's hard to think of food, I would say nutrients. So, for example, there is this amino acid called methionine, which is broken down in our bodies in ways that essentially increase the amount of a particular factor, which is then added on to the DNA, to proteins, which is the molecular machinery of cells, or even to RNA, which we can think of the single-use copies of genes that cells use to then make the molecular machinery. So this methionine, or parts of this methionine, end up on tags on this biological molecules. And these tags essentially can turn off different or help turn off different genes. So this can be a good thing in some cases, but you can also have too much silencing of these genetic switches. For example, some cancer cells actually end up silencing so many genetic switches in genes that are important to halt division. And that's how they end up dividing and proliferating out of control.
So how do I know when I'm putting my diet together that I'm making the best choice for my particular genetic makeup? There are some programs out there, one of them I'm familiar with, takes a look at your genetic profile and then claims to be able to build a diet that's best for you. Does that make sense?
Yes. So we have to think of the interactions between food and genes essentially in two ways. The first way is the way we have been talking about, where components of the food we eat can affect our genome and its genetic switches. The other way is that we are all born. The other way is that we're all born with a makeup of genes and variants. And although you and I probably share most of the genes and the variations, I call them sort of like ice cream flavor, right? It's ice cream, but it can come in strawberry or chocolate. The same thing for gene. There is a genes involved, for instance, in division, but it can come in different flavors. And those different flavors can affect the way you interact, your body function, and also the way it interacts with those nutrients. So there's really this two-way communication between food and genes, and this genetic testing that people can buy online and just send some of their DNA with a cheek swab. So the thing is that we really don't have sufficient scientific knowledge or proof to really know that the variants we're born with or that we inherited really affect the type of diet we should consume. So it is true that we know of a few genes that clearly have this food and gene effect. For example, there is this gene called FTO, or another gene called MC4R, that we know that if you inherit certain variants and you eat a diet that's high in saturated fat or refined sugar, you have increased risk of high body mass index and metabolic disease. But these are risks, so it's not that if you're born with that gene specifically, you'll get a certain outcome. This is different than things, for instance, like celiac, right? If you have the gene variants for celiac or the gene variants that make you lactose intolerant, well, we know that if you consume gluten or lactose, then there is a negative outcome and that you shouldn't. So we're making strides in understanding these gene-diet interactions, but really a lot of these direct-to-consumer tests are not meant to diagnose. They're meant to tell you, you carry this variant and this could be a risk. Now, whether that will impact your health, I think in the future with more studies, that is very likely that we will be able to confirm and give clinical value and validity to this. But as of now, I like to think of more of them as wellness or lifestyle. Like you can change your lifestyle to try to match your gene, and it might or might not have an effect.
Makes sense. I get it. Well, let's go there. I'm really curious. So you've obviously spent a lot of time researching this. How has it changed the way you live? What food choices do you make based on your research that I might benefit from?
Yes. So in many ways, I like to think that we know already what type of choices we should make. For example, we know that from human studies that fiber is really important and that we're not getting enough because we're all busy. And we buy prepackaged food which tend not to have a lot of fiber. We also know that high level of sugar can affect things like cavities and promote cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease. And so we know that we should cut down on sugar. But I think the way it's really impacted me is that I look at food labels and I look at how many grams of fiber is in there, how many grams of sugar, especially for things where I wouldn't expect to be sugar. Obviously, if I'm celebrating some member of my family's birthday, we're going to have cake. I know I'm eating sugar, right? It's sugar and fat and it tastes delicious. But if I am eating bread, I wouldn't necessarily think that there's sugar in there. But in fact, some types of breads actually have added sugar. And so what I do now before I buy something at the grocery store, I just look through the label. Now, it's not that easy because, for example, in the case of sugar, it comes in so many different names, but now that it's hard to identify. But now if you look in most labels, there is an added sugar label. And so you can say, well, this food usually doesn't have that much sugar, but they added 6 or 8 grams. For example, vegan milk, right? Some people consume a vegan diet because it's plant-based and it has some health benefits. But then if I'm buying my own milk and it's sweetened with vanilla, and then I look, there might be 8 grams of sugar there. And so that's an example in which a quote unquote healthy food has been turned into something that it's potentially counterproductive for your health because it has so much sugar. So that's really the way it has changed my diet. I feel like we can be empowered by knowledge and by looking at food labels, and then with more and more research and making this research available, then we can continue to be empowered in our food choices.
Are there foods that we simply should avoid because of their ability to activate genes in a negative way?
I don't think we're quite there, Lee, to make the statement. I think there are foods that, we should have in moderation. For example, one thing we haven't talked about is the microbiome. And so we are part of a food chain where the food we eat feeds the microbiome in our body. And we have, I said, 25 to 30,000 genes, but the whole community of microorganisms that lives inside us, not just in our gut, but our skin and mucosa, they have something like 3 million genes. So a lot more genetic switches. So this microorganism help us digest and process components of food we can digest. For example, a lot of the fiber or some of the complex carbohydrates that we consume with food. And so what we know is that when they break down this food, they also produce some molecules that in turn can affect our genetic switches in good ways. For example, when we eat a lot of fiber, the microbiome makes short-chain fatty acids. The short-chain fatty acids then are metabolized in different ways and can activate genetic switches in our own cells. And so we know that if we eat what people call sometimes a Western diet, which is essentially processed food, high in fat and high in refined sugar, then there isn't enough fiber, so we don't get some of those compounds that a microbiome is processing, which, can essentially increase the risk of things like colon cancer, for example. So I don't like personally to demonize some foods. I think it's really important to eat mindfully. And if somebody wants to have cake with their kids for their birthday or for their own birthday, I think they should have it. Desserts and are part of any culture celebration. So I like to think of food and our relationship with food as something that it's very intimate. It doesn't just fuel us, it also affects our genome. And we can try to eat foods in moderation and read the label to try to understand, what works best for us.
Oh, I am so on board with that. You are talking to Mr. Microbiome. I'm very, very dialed into all of that stuff. So help me as we wrap things up here. Look ahead and tell me what do you expect to come out of your lab that is eventually going to change lives?
So one thing I'm really interested is to really try to draw a causal connections between components of food and genetic switches. So a lot of the nutritional studies we have are observational studies, especially those that are done in humans, which is obviously more relevant because we want to understand how nutrition affects us humans, not necessarily fruit flies and mice. The problem with some of those studies is that they can't really clearly define causation. What do I mean? I mean, do high level, and exactly how much is a high level? That's an important question too, of sugar. Does it actually turn off or on this genetic switch? What is the range? What are other circumstances? For example, if the animal now is exercising or if the person is now smoking or consuming alcohol. So I for me, it's really important to study animal models to try to really get to some of these questions of causality and really connecting things. This very similar way that we were able to connect smoke or tobacco smoke from cigarettes to an increased risk of cancer. So I think the most important work that will come up from my lab will definitely be to draw some causal connections so that we can then carry on the studies or this knowledge in translational way in preclinical models and humans. However, if I may just add one thing, is that, as a field, not just talking about my lab, but as a field, I think we are going to see some important outcomes from this nutrigenomics and nutrigenetics research. And my personal guess, informed guess, but a guess nonetheless, is that it will probably be in the treatment of cancer research. There is a field called cancer metabolism that essentially studies the interaction between metabolism and the ability of cancer to proliferate, dedifferentiate, move, migrate, and metastasize. And so, like I said, they have mapped some of this metabolic pathway and the way they're fueled by nutrients to increase metastases, migration, proliferation. So I think now we can think of a not so far future where we can pair a chemosensory regimen with also a dietary regimen where if we know, for example, that colon cancer cells are addicted to this amino acid called serine, we can also try to give people a diet that has low serine levels together with the chemotherapy to attack this disease from two different sides so that they are complementary. And so you can think of that as some people have treatment-resistant epilepsy, they go on a ketogenic diet, they can do quite well, they can decrease their symptoms. And I think the first breakthrough of nutrigenomics will probably be in the context of cancer treatment. And again, it's a guess, but I think that's, I'll be willing to bet some dessert in it.
Okay, a high-fat, high-sugar dessert.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. That's very funny. Well, listen, I certainly appreciate your time. I look forward to, obviously, that breakthrough and more information coming out of your lab. That's Monica Deuce. She is the Assistant Professor of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and everybody have a good day.